Welcome to the Religious Treehouse podcast. I'm your co-host Matthew.
And I'm your other co host, Jodie.
Oh, so good to be here. Happy New Year. At the time of this release, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, everyone. It is an exciting time. New Year means new you, maybe, or at least a new resolution. One of mine is going to be that I'm going to stand stronger and speak a little louder about my beliefs and convictions. Like, still keep that space to hear other people's. But I'm very much a person who kind of if I think it's not acceptable to everyone else, I'm like, stuff it down. But you know what? As a big first step, I am wearing my Taylor Swift t-shirt today.
Yeah,
So I'm being loud about my love right now.
good. Yeah, no, we love Taylor Swift.
Yeah,
She
we do.
sings.
What
Um,
about you, Matthew?
yeah, my goal, I think is influenced by, my experience in the past few days is to understand social media. It doesn't make sense to me. It's an anomaly. I think it's, a cesspool of the wild, wild west. But we're going to figure it out. Maybe. That's the goal, at least. I think the problem with so many New Year's resolutions is that they don't, they're not measurable, which, I can't measure that. Um, but also that you give up on them. And I think that this battle that I've decided to wage against social media can last all year long. I don't think that's going to be something I can give up on too quickly. So I'm excited for this year long battle. And I fully expect social media to win, but we're going to figure it out.
And you know what? The most important part of a resolution is to really just kind of stick with it. Last year, I did this really cool thing. It was a pagan, and we can get into this another time off of the podcast. But basically, you burned pieces of paper and you released these resolutions to the universe, like the universe would help you with them. And then you kept one that you yourself worked on. And as we're here at the dawn of a new year, I'm finding that some of the things I just gave up to the universe kind of figured themselves out.
Sure.
But I
Yeah.
still kept with them. They were there in the back of my mind.
Right,
So,
right. So did you really give it up then?
no, I have too much of a control issue. But it was a nice thought, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, we tried. And if it makes us feel happier, if it makes us feel better, more power to you.
Yeah. So, we've been doing this podcast for a little bit, and there may be some terms or ideas we haven't touched base on.
Yeah, no, I figured it would be a good idea to kind of have, a brief episode to kind of talk through some terminologies and stuff that we use. Just kind of, we're starting the new year. So maybe we can touch on, a lot of things that we talk about. So, this episode isn't really going to have a direct theme, I suppose, but we're just going to talk through some important terminologies
It's like
of the biblical
housekeeping.
scholar. Yeah, we're doing a little housekeeping episode for funsies.
Yeah. So,
But
first on
yeah,
the
I think
housekeeping.
yeah, I figure we can start with how we refer to God. Particularly in the Christian, Jewish, biblical context. How does the Bible refer to God? First of all, do you have any thoughts before we dive into a few terminologies?
I mean, some of my favorite references to God outside of the church include Big Daddy G.
Okay,
Um, God is my dog because God spelled backwards is dog.
sure.
Um, Big guy. Like
Big,
there's
yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of casual slang names. And I know that's not what we're going to talk about, but I thought they deserved reference.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, in Arrested Development, one of my favorite scenes is the character Job sees a billboard with the word God on it, and he says, "Jode, who's Jode?" Because he spells his name Gob, and Job. It's funny. But yeah, biblically, God is somewhat unique in getting a definite name. often in English spelled YHWH. And in a lot of Jewish communities and some Christian communities, that name isn't spoken. So in a purely academic context, I would talk to it. But since this is a public podcast type thing going out to the world, out of respect, we refer to it in other ways. Um, but yeah, in Hebrew it's Yod He Vav He. If you look in your Bible and you look at a verse and you have the word Lord in like capital letters, but like a little smaller, that's usually what they're translating as the divine name. So if you just see Lord, Lord, spelled regularly, and then how it would normally be spelled, that's probably the word Adonai, which just means my Lord or Lord. But if you see it in the capital letters, that's translating the divine name of God. And you look surprised.
Yeah, no, I didn't know that because no one told me the Bible looks like that because it's being translated from this and it's an indicator of this thing happening.
Mm,
Like that's they don't really sit you down and teach you how to read the Bible. They just, and when I say they, I'm talking about evangelical churches,
right.
at least from my experience. So yeah, no, I did not know that or realize that because I remember looking at Lord and I'm like, it's that doesn't match up with the rest of the font. Must be a misprint.
Yeah. Nope, nope. If you see the little font change, that's because it's referring to the divine name.
Wow. Okay.
Um, but yeah, and then you also hear Jehovah sometimes be like the name of God. And that's done from, that originates during the medieval period where it combines those letters, YHWH, how we would have it in English, with the vowels from the word Adonai, which means Lord. So in like the Hebrew manuscripts, we have the vowels and the consonants, but the vowels are of the word Adonai. So by, placing those vowels in there, we get, something that kind of looks like Jehovah. And then, because German scholars did their thing, the J sound is the Y, and we have the J now, which is J. We get Jehovah. So a lot of times you'll hear, Jehovah Jireh, um, God who provides, or whatever that is. But Jehovah is another name that people, will switch that out for.
That's so cool though, how they kind of like scrambled it together.
Yeah.
They copy and pasted from this and
Yeah.
then because this is translated this way, it sounds like this. Ugh, I love a good origin story.
Yeah. But no. And then, again, as we get around this word, most of the times you'll replace it with Adonai, which means Lord. That's something I need to get into a better habit of doing. Usually I just say God, 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 God this, God that. But, I should say Adonai. It's a little more specific. Another option is Hashem, which in Hebrew just means the name. Um, and if we want to get, grammatical about it, it's called the tetragrammaton because it's just four letters. So that's our fun little, $2 word there, tetragrammaton. But yeah, this is often, traced back to Exodus 3:14, where, Adonai famously says, I am who I am, which we can talk about how to translate that better. And they think, oh, that must be the name of God. What's happening there is Ehiyah Asher Ehiyah isn't, the name of God there. It's God responding to Moses asking, hey, who do I say is talking to me? Who do I say is sending me? But, that's the verse that we often go back to.
Mhm. Okay. I've always really liked the I am who I am. It's always felt like so philosophical.
Yeah,
I
no.
am who I am.
Yeah, no, we can talk about how, translating that is unique. I always think of Popeye in his song, I am who I am. But um, no, it's fun stuff. But the other thing that you'll get when referring to God is often the word Elohim. We see that in Genesis 1. In Genesis 2 and 3, we get Adonai more so, and often we get Adonai Elohim, which is just another construction of God. But Elohim is grammatically plural. It can also be used to refer to a deity or deities, or just, vaguely speaking, divine beings. And no, this doesn't mean the God of Israel or whatever. Doesn't mean Adonai is a plural. It's a grammatically plural word that often and does refer to a single deity.
Okay, but Elohim, divine beings, the plurality of it all. I mean, I just feel like I want to address it more because I don't know. I've had this idea now just pop into my head while we're talking. That's why you're getting no warning. It's like, could this have started off with like an idea of multiple and then they kind of just whittled it down like, no, we'll just do one and he's more powerful than everyone else.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in in um in the patriarchal North Semitic deity, the high god, like the Canaanite region, was El, and El is the singular of Elohim, and El is this high god, the main, the Zeus of this pantheon. Um, and as that word moved on to mean other things, it just began to refer to God in general. And there's pretty good evidence that within that pantheon, the storm god Baal, which I'm sure you've heard of in biblical talk. No, oh, but the storm god Baal is often like placed up against Adonai in a lot of biblical texts, and there's good reason to think that that Adonai adopted the divine profile of Baal, who's the storm deity, which is why there's so much imagery in that overlaps between Baal and Adonai. So the way backs, there might be some overlap between Baal and Adonai.
Really, a storm deity? I'm trying to think of what other storm deities could have been around at the time.
No, it's not Zeus. It's not Zeus, Jody. Uh,
Thor?
no.
I don't know, man. Well, but you have to think, isn't that so interesting? I mean, everyone obviously experiences weather, but for quite a few cultures and religions to be like, oh, we're gonna have a storm god.
Yeah, but it's not it. These religions exist and they're separate. And, they can have influences, inspiration from other religions of the area. And I think Greek might be later. I could be mistaken. But no, it's very common for these things to pop up independently, and it would make sense. I don't think that we should be conflating all these religions together and reducing each religion to say, oh, it's all the same thing. I think they're very important differences, and very different origins that need to be respected and talked about.
Then let me be clearer. I think it is interesting, though, that as humans evolved, these similar ideas did pop up across different
Yeah.
cultures.
Right. Yeah.
So
No.
that's more what I meant to say, but I understand how I came off, especially with the
No.
manic look in my eyes. Because you know me, I love a good conspiracy theory, and there are so many out there about the Bible.
Oh yeah, there are so many, so many.
Okay, but I will
Um,
put this chew toy down.
yeah, yeah. But no, we'll also get variations of L in like names. So Israel, Bethel, Danielle. So these names have some extra added meaning for like why they're named such things, and they'll also or often have L, referring um, to God, in the names and stuff. And we also get that with Adonai, like a Hallelujah. So praise God. There might be a little conflation there. And lastly, we just have the term God, and I think a lot of people get confused. They think God is Adonai's name, whereas God is a title. Like, there's just God, God, and still in some communities they put that respect on that term, because they're using that instead of Adonai. So like if I have friends who I'm like texting and stuff, and they refer to God as, and they don't want to type out the whole name or the whole word God, they do like G-D. Just it's the same thing as Adonai. Like out of respect, I like replicate it. Because
You're
I'm
just
talking to,
matching the energy.
yeah, you match the energy, and that's why we don't say Adonai. We replace it with Adonai.
I mean, respect is kind of just matching the energy of whoever you're
Yeah,
talking with. And that's such a simple thing to do. And honestly, probably more consideration than people do think to give.
yeah, and it's completely free. So like,
Consideration is free, guys. This just in. Breaking news. You can be a nice human being for no money.
yeah, yeah, it may not get as many views on Twitter, but it's still free.
Oh my gosh, you're so right though about like social media being a cesspool. It's a mixed bag. You might get the good stuff, you might get the bad stuff. And I always just really hope our stuff ends up with the good stuff.
Hopefully, yeah, and that's the point. We're learning. We're learning how to like put it towards the good stuff. But who knows? We'll
Okay.
see. All right. So the next thing that we're talking about is going to be the pronouns around God, and how we can navigate that. Um, Again, before I get into my rant, do you have any thoughts? I'm sure you do.
Why do we need to have pronouns? Why does anyone need a pronoun? Okay? Honestly, that's as extreme as I'm going to take it right now. But when you think about a divine being and that everyone is created in
Hmm.
their image, and they create man and woman, I think that does imply that their image would reflect both. And also, why would any divine being be limited by our definition of gender?
Yeah. No, I think this gets to the heart of some Christians, debate. Like they say, a lot will say like God transcends gender, but somehow that's often also, in their argument that we should refer to God using masculine pronouns. And it confuses me. But the argument that God transcends gender, like it makes sense. This is a theological claim, not so much a biblical claim. And we'll talk about the differences of those later. Um, but no, it begs the question of like why how do we refer to this divine being? And it's so ingrained into us that it's a masculine figure that we say he. So that's what a lot of us say just out of habit. Um, but yeah, like grammatically in the Bible, uh, the God is almost always exclusively referred to using masculine verbs, masculine pronouns, and stuff like that. So grammatically, it makes sense to think of God masculinely. But if we want to look at the metaphors, how God is um, portrayed in the Hebrew Bible specifically, it's by and large masculine, but not exclusive. You know, some that come to mind is Genesis 1, humanity is made in the image of God. As you said, perhaps that means God has a more feminine side, or in Isaiah 66, as a mother comforts her child, so will I comfort you. Um, and that's putting a feminine perspective on God. And I think as I said, by and large, God is portrayed masculine, but not always. There are those exceptions. But yeah, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I just think we as mere humans should stop putting our ideas and the things we've made up onto divine beings. They didn't ask for it. These are
Yeah,
constructs, people.
right. Yeah. Um, no, definitely. Like, like some people, some scholars will get, really, they have strong feelings on this. It's not something I care too much about. Um, like if we refer to God as He, it's like okay, that's fine. Like we know what's talking here. Oh, do you
What does it
disagree?
change? What does it change? What is being said, to like define them as male or female?
Mhm.
Like, does that really affect the message?
Yeah, I mean, I think. how you envision, how you think of, deity, really affects, perhaps subconsciously, it really affects, what's going on. And I think if we were to go back to ancient Israelite religion, I think it would be, I don't think we would be surprised to see if they pictured God as a masculine deity with a penis with, masculine traits. I think that's how God is um, depicted and thought of. And at times we see Adonai with a wife or a consort. Um, so like this idea that God transcends gender, that God doesn't have gender is, somewhat modern. Like it's not always been that way. So, academically, when referring to God in light of this, it's, generally accepted that we say God or God's self instead of he or him, or, sometimes they will work. But, not something I get all bent up about. I try to just be, gender neutral when referring to God, but I slip up sometimes. But I think it's worth considering. Like how does the language we use when referring to deity affect how we think, how others think, and stuff like that.
I like that. I respect that. But we are blaming the patriarchy.
Sure, if you want to, we can blame the
Well,
patriarchy.
that's what it sounds like. We want to
Yeah.
display a man, a strong man with I was going to get too descriptive about the genitals. Um, but they like I can see how we ended up there, and I understand why academically it's just a lot of study of the Bible. It doesn't really come from academics.
Right.
And so then you have to think about the lay people, the common people, people like me, like how are they supposed to define it while looking through their faith? And like
Mm,
who really has a right to tell you how to define it?
yeah.
So, but academically, no, totally down with being like they. I'm good with a he, they.
Right. No, no, yeah, academically, I try to keep it they. But again, not something I get angry about.
I'm not angry, I'm passionate.
Oh, and we love passion.
We love
Love
passion.
it.
You know what else I'm passionate about? The fact that I was lied to. Like, why would you tell me it should be ADBC, but then they've been using CE and BCE for the last couple hundred years?
Yeah, what a transition into our next terminology. Yeah, I'll use CE and BCE, the Common Era or before Common Era. Whereas, it feels like um, it feels like AD and BC is much more traditional, Anno Domini and before Christ. And yeah, it's our first episode of the new year. What a great time to talk about the calendar and years and stuff.
Guys, I pitched calendars as an idea, and Matthew was like, flesh that out for me. And, in my head, I'm like, calendars, like, just look up facts about calendars. I understand he was correct, but I would like to recognize that I feel very special and that this was put in for me. Don't
Yeah,
take it away
so
from me.
it's hard when I'm presented an idea so broad as calendars, and I'm just supposed to be like, I'm just supposed to have this knowledge about all the calendars and how they relate to like religions and stuff. I'm like, I can do research, that's fine, but what about calendars?
Stop speaking so knowledgeably and with such authority, okay? It tricks me into thinking you know everything.
I don't. I'll tell you that right now. I don't. But we'll talk about a couple calendars. We'll
Okay.
talk first about the Hebrew calendar. So in the Hebrew calendar, this is the year 5785, 5785 AM, Anno Mundi, the year of the world. Um, Oh, you look upset about
I
that.
don't like that. I don't like to think about being in the year. I know that we are on an earth that has been around for a very, very long time. When I think about the years it's been around, I get I get sick in the tummy.
Sure, sure. Oh, but yeah, I mean that one, obviously is related to how we get the 6,000 year old. The Earth is 6,000 year old, and that's it. Trying to tie it back to that. Um,
What's the starting point? What is like ground zero?
for that one,
Yeah.
I think they try to tie it back to 7 days of creation.
Okay.
I think that's the math. They say, okay, this is where we're at, and I'd say um, most Jews don't like take that as science anymore. Now that we know that the Earth is older and stuff, but traditionally we would say it's the year 5785. Um, and then next up we have the Islamic calendar, and this is the year 1446 AH Anno Higere. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's in the year of the Hijrah, or sometimes it's just shortened to H in more Muslim countries. And before that day, is BH, before the Hijrah.
Okay.
And this starting date is in 622 CE, using our calendar. And the Hijrah is when Muhammad and his followers migrated from Mecca to Medina. And so that's the date that's set as ground zero in a lot of Islamic calendars.
I like that. That's cool. I like both of these. I think it's very interesting to think about the starting dates of a calendar.
Yeah, no, and then we get to our Western calendar, how we're used to it um, with CE and BCE, and because and the reason we use that is because it's so standard in Western academia. This is the Western way of counting years, so that's what's standard for us. And the point of this is Christianity being so dominant by keeping CE and BCE, it still keeps the Christian reference point, perhaps as a result of globalization. Um, but I often hear critiques of Christians saying, "Oh, we're taking Christianity out of the calendar. This is, the atheist critique."
Why should a religion be centered of the calendar? Like there are so many.
Yeah, yeah, no, and it's and that's the point. Like, if we even to like adjust the terminology to Common Era and before the Common Era, it invites non-Christian scholars, non-Christians to engage in the conversation without, making having to force them to make a claim about the divinity of Jesus. Like, just the switch of terminology. Um, and it makes people feel more welcome to talk about it. So, like, again, this is another instance of it's free, and so why not? Why not be welcoming?
Like not everything has to be centered around one religion. In fact, I think there are writings on why things like that are not so great.
Yeah.
When you center everything around just one specific group of people, kind of
Yeah.
people, and people's beliefs.
Yeah. Yeah. Wait, and then on top of that, it's more accurate. Like, as we talked about with our Jesus episode, Jesus was likely born, around 4 BCE. And so, like, whenever, the idea of AD and BC, that started like 500 years after the birth of Jesus and stuff like that. Um, so, the idea that, like, saying BC and or BCE and CE as the common eras is a little bit more accurate because, as we've learned how to like figure out when Jesus was born and stuff a little bit more, we get a little bit more specific with it.
Yeah.
But also, this isn't a new thing. A lot of people I hear say, "Oh, this is this new idea that we're switching out AD and BC with CE and CE." And I think the first time we see the Common Era referred is in the early 17th century. Yeah, and we get Johannes Kepler referring to the Common Era, or translated into English. I think he was speaking in German, the Vulgar Era, which back then meant the Common Era. And then in English, we get that in the 17th century in a book printed for someone named H. Rhodes, whoever that is. But we get that reference to the Common Era, and then I think it appears in the dictionary by the late 18th century as well as like something more common. So the idea of a Common Era and before the Common Era isn't new; it's hundreds of years old, and it's just a way to open the conversation for everyone.
Perhaps to make all feel welcome, to open our
Mayhaps,
arms to people who think differently. What a novel idea.
yeah,
No, I like
uh,
that. Okay, I can transition because, until recently I was using the BCAD because
yeah,
that's just what I grew up on. I can
yeah.
get down with the CEBCE.
Right.
I'm
And
in.
again, not something I'm like super angry about. Like famously, Neil deGrasse Tyson, um, who's astrophysicist and atheist and stuff like that, he continues to use AD and BC. So like it's not it's preference. And I think his excuse is like um, it was formulated by a Christian community, and like we should respect that. Like, hey, this Christian community like put the work in to do this, so like keep the terminology or whatever. Again, not a big deal per se, but people have their preferences.
Didn't Neil deGrasse Tyson also demote Pluto?
That's true. He did demote Pluto, so maybe we should be taking what he's saying seriously.
No, no, no. I mean I think that means we take it less seriously.
Right, right,
Pluto's trying so hard.
right, right.
Pluto is doing its best and it was demoted. Like who
Yeah,
does that? Sorry.
it's sad. I mean, we're going on a tangent here for funsies, but I get where he's coming from with Pluto because if you look at Pluto's moon and like combine their rotational thing, that their center of gravity is outside of where like Pluto exists. So like their center of gravity isn't in Pluto, and like that's not a planet. Then if it's rotating not against itself but around something else, like the Earth wobbles, we got a little wobble because of the moon, but Pluto has a big, big wobble, so big that maybe it's not a planet. I don't like the way you're looking at me.
I don't like the way you're talking. So I think we can call that a draw.
Yeah.
And we'll drop this one for now. I'll see you on Fortnite. Is what that look says.
Sure, sure. But yeah, that's the years. I'm happy that we got to include your calendars a little bit.
Thank you so much. It was so fun. If you enjoyed this broad topic, let us know so I can introduce more broad topics.
Yeah. Let us know if
Yeah,
you want to learn about more calendars.
Matthew would love more unfettered out ideas. So, some more terminology. And I would like to do this in a fun way. I would like you to give the term, I will
Okay.
give my guess, and then you can tell me how I'm inaccurate.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so like let's start with Hebrew.
Okay. Hebrew was the second one. I'm sorry, I didn't label which was which. I thought we would go in order. A language and ancient ethnicity, kind of similar to the Sumerians. Like when I say ancient
Right.
ethnicity.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, so definitely Hebrew is the language. In this terminology, we're talking about people groups, which wouldn't be evident based on this being the first one. But yeah, it's an ancient Northern Semitic people, um, and often, and the way that we'll use this, and that's the point. There's big debates on how these words are used. The point of us talking about this is how we will be using these in the context of this, larger conversation. But Hebrew primarily refers to the descendants of the patriarchs, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, stuff like that. Um, and some people use that going up until like the second century BCE. I generally will use it to refer to, pre-monarchic people. So before the monarchy of Northern Israel, I'll generally refer to it as Hebrew and Hebrews. This could perhaps come from an Egyptian word Habiru, which appears in some like 13th and 12th century Egyptian texts. It might be a slur of sorts to kind of refer to a nomadic group of people, but that could be where the word originates from. But the main idea is if I refer to Hebrews, it's going to be before the monarchy.
Okay. And when we're talking about the Egyptians, do we think they were commonly using this word and slur back in the Mosesy times or before then?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
That's the general idea of like it
Okay.
when Moses supposedly was around. It would have been around that time, 12th,
Okay.
13th century.
Cute.
Next up, Israelite.
Someone from the ancient kingdom of Israel in the Bible.
Yeah, no, I think the important word that you use there is ancient. I conversations I have with people, they'll refer to people from modern Israel as Israelites. And I don't see that all the time, but I do see it sometimes. Modern Israel, if you're from Israel, you're an Israeli. Um, but we refer to Israelite as someone, um, and there's ways to flesh this out as from the ancient kingdom of northern or southern Israel. And usually this term will continue up until the return from the Babylonian exile, up until the Second Kingdom or the Second Temple. So yeah, ancient Israelite kingdom, people of that area. Judean.
Someone from Judah?
Yeah. And what is Judah?
I don't know.
Right. So Judah is one of the tribes of ancient Israel,
Oh,
of the Israel kingdom. There's 12 tribes. In the southern kingdom, you've got uh, the tribe of Benjamin and the tribe of Judah. After everything happens and the kingdom gets destroyed, essentially what's left is Judah, and that's where Jerusalem and all that those places are. And generally, after the destruction of the first kingdom, um, I wouldn't consider them Judeans per se, but after um, the Persian period and the reconstruction of the temple, I'd say that's appropriate when we would call them Judeans. And there's it's a debate like what these things are. Again, generally speaking, for the purposes of this episode, that's about it.
fun fact. Did you know that the origin of my name may come from the word Judah?
Makes sense. It has a J.
Yeah, well, I like to look up the origins of people's names and then like watch as it breaks down. And I
Mm,
watched a video one time on Judah to Jody, and I was like, okay, I vibe with that.
yeah. It the amount of names that originate from John or variations of John is like astounding. Like everything is John, and it just stresses me out.
And it makes the John Doe thing even funnier.
Yeah, like it's probably John.
Probably John. Probably some variation of John.
Right, right.
Okay.
And then lastly we have Jew.
Someone who practices the Jewish faith or and I don't know how strongly I feel that this is going to match up or is of the matrilineage of
Yeah.
Jew.
Okay. Right. So Jew comes from the word Judean, and I think it can pretty much be used in place of the word Judean, and it's what people continue to refer to themselves today. Um, and it's hard to define exactly what makes someone Jewish. Um, it's not as cut and dry as it might seem. But broadly speaking, it can be someone who identifies as part of the Jewish religion or has some connection through descent or conversion or you know some sort of connection to the Jewish people. But the main takeaway here in the topic of biblical studies is that if we're looking at the first kingdom, I don't think it would be appropriate to refer to them as Jewish. But once we get to the Persian period, to Esther, for example, the story of Esther, I think that's much more appropriate when we can start using Jewish as a terminology.
Okay, so there might be like maybe not an agreed upon, but a general idea of when the cutoff is, because we did say like the Hebrew was an ancient ethnicity, and there are
Mm,
ancient ethnicities. There are plenty around the world.
right.
So
Yeah,
it's,
that continued to this day as well.
yeah, okay. I can vibe with that. I'm good with
Yeah.
that.
And then this is, we'll be rehashing this when we talked about it, I think in episode 1. But the
Yes.
books, we have the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, and New Testament. Jody, would you like to summarize these for us?
The Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible are the same, but also a little different because of the way the Bible and Old Testament is taught in evangelical churches. Or I guess maybe I should say Christian churches, because they then try, when you add the New Testament on, they try to backtrack to the Old Testament to say, see how these connect, which is something we touched on in our episode about the birth of Christ.
Yeah. Yeah, no, broadly speaking, Old Testament, Hebrew Bible mean the same things. Often I'll refer to Old Testament when referring to, Christian interpretation of it, and Hebrew Bible is more, of the Jewish interpretation. Um, and the Christian ordering of it is a little different. The Jewish version is a little different. The Masoretic text, which is, what if we translate into English, is generally a starting point. That is a little bit different than the ordering of the modern Jewish text that we have. Um, but yeah, so like the ordering is a little bit different, but it refers to the same collection of books mostly. Some people include the Apocrypha within the Old Testament and stuff like that. Other options for this are First Testament or Older Testament. Again, as we said in the first episode, generally speaking, unless I'm like specifically referring to like the Christian way of interpreting these texts, which in there I'll say Old Testament, but generally speaking, I'll refer to it as Hebrew Bible, not to give authority to one interpretation or the other, but just because that's the language in which it's written. For the most part, it was a little bit in Aramaic, but for the most part, it was written in Hebrew.
Okay.
And then we get to the New Testament, and that's the Jesus books, the Book of Acts. You get epistles, you get people's mail, revelations, that type of stuff. For the most part, everyone just calls it New Testament. I've heard some say it's the Newer Testament, as the way to say like, hey, it doesn't like completely replace the Old Testament. And I'm conflicted on how I feel about Newer Testament. Um, so I usually just stick with New Testament.
You just said people's mail.
Yeah, people's mail. It's in the New Testament.
No, and you are 100% correct. But when someone brings you a phrase or a new way to speak about something, and my flabber is gasted.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, I know exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about the letters, but that was someone's mail.
It was, yeah.
And then I just think about my mail and I'm like, no, that wouldn't make it into a book.
No, it's way too many ads.
Oh, no,
Ads and
that's fun.
bills. That's all that mail is anymore. You don't get any revolutionary concepts in mail anymore.
Nope. Ugh. Okay. Now, the different kinds of studies.
Yeah. Okay. So this is one that does anger me. The other ones that we talk about, fine, whatever. We talk how we talk. This one we want to get specific. So I have a master's degree in religious studies. And within religious studies, my specialization is in Jewish studies and biblical studies. I am not a theologian. I have never studied theology. And I think if we, flesh out the differences between religious studies, biblical studies, and theological studies, I think that's very important because every time I have dinner with my aunt or someone like that, they introduce me as, hey, this guy studies Old Testament theology. And it's a conversation that I have to have every time. No, I don't study theology. It's something very different. So let's dive into this. First of all, let's start with religious studies. How would you define religious studies?
Religious studies is the study of different religions and the role of them in society and culture.
I like how you have your notes. You're like, I'm writing this down. I'm not going to be caught off guard.
No, because I had to learn to differentiate between cultural anthropology and all the different kinds of anthropologies, you know? So
Yeah.
I understand why you take this seriously. Like it is, there is a difference, and people want to be like, oh, the social sciences. Like, oh yeah, the social sciences. So there's so many different ones.
Yeah.
So put respect on it. But yes, continue.
But yeah, no, but no, religious studies, often, it's the broad study of religion, how it's practiced, how to define religion. That's hard to do. We'll have to do an episode on that at some point. What is religion? Who knows? It's our job to define it. None of us can agree. But the best way I've heard religious studies, talked about is that we're the leech of the university because we take from all the different areas of study to somehow talk about what we call religion, however we define it. And we take from sociology, from history, from literature, economics, philosophy, anthropology, art history, whatever, and all these different the I had a professor on religious studies, and he has his PhD in art history. Like it's the perspective of how we use these different studies in order to understand and talk about religion. Um, and you get subcategories: Jewish studies, Islamic studies, material culture, within religious studies. That is much more what I study than theology. It's not theology. And so that's the other thing. In an airport, people ask, what do you study? All that stuff. I'm like, oh, religious studies. And the question they ask me every time after that is, oh, are you a pastor? It's like, no, I'm not a pastor. I'm studying religion, like what religion does and what they believe and all that stuff. Um, but in this, you know, Christian culture of the world, they hear religion, and the first instinct a lot of the time is, oh, Christian, pastor.
Do you ever get asked where you went to seminary school?
Yeah, sometimes, especially around here, because Duke Seminary is a really big seminary. So I tell people, oh, I study religion at Duke, and they automatically assume that means, oh, he studied at Duke Seminary. Um, but no, and like so when I graduated, they asked us, oh, what's your major? And my friend said religious studies, so they gave him um, the theology school robes and stuff. And he had to go back the next day after I told him, like, no, you have the wrong robes. And he had to get the graduate school robes instead of the um, theology school robes. So it's funny. Even the people here at Duke and stuff are like, theology, religion, same thing.
And it's most definitely not,
Yeah.
especially because, I, religious studies, it looks so far, it looks at everything.
Mm-hmm.
It looks at the economic hardships that were happening at the time. It looks at what the culture was towards specific things or people
Mm-hmm.
and how all of these things influence each other. I hate to sound crazy, it's all connected.
But yeah, and there's two main ways of looking at this.
Mhm.
There's the emic perspective and the edic perspective, the insider's perspective or the outsider's perspective. And you probably know this from anthropology and stuff. But the insider's perspective, the emic perspective, looks at the beliefs and practices and values from the perspective of those within a community. So looking at it from the insider's perspective, we say, oh, they believe they do this ritual because, you know, it pleases this god per se, for example. Whereas the outsider's perspective, the edict perspective, is the perspective of an outside researcher, and that tends to be the functional significance of why people do things, why they believe things. Oh, they do this ritual because it creates a sense of group bonding or something like that. Um, and I think both are important ways that we have to look at religion. We have to understand from the outsider's perspective why they're doing what they're doing, but also why they say what they're doing and how that's important.
And the time it takes for that consideration is free.
Yeah. Yeah. And then next up, we have biblical studies, which, again, an area that I do a lot of my stuff in. I do religious studies, Jewish studies, which is why a lot of times I'll talk about art and stuff. Um, that's separate from biblical studies for the most part. But my training in Jewish studies says, "Oh, art. How does that deal with stuff?" And it's fun. I love art. But biblical studies is more so the background of the Bible. How did the Bible come to be? What are the social and cultural and political and literary settings of what's being written and who it's being written for, and all those types of things. Um, and it often uses historical critical methods, which are tools of critical thinking, and applying it to the Bible and history, um, and archaeology and stuff like that. Whereas theology, on the other hand, is asking much more questions of who is God, how do we deal with God, how should we live, what should we do. And it focuses on this nature of the divine. So the biblical author would ask, how does Genesis portray God? Where the theologian would ask, what does Genesis tell us about the nature of God? I'm much more interested in talking about how Genesis portrays God, for example. What does this biblical text and its background tell us, and how can we understand that? And the theologian theoretically would use what the biblical scholar says to formulate their creeds and ideas and make claims about the nature of God. And the problem with a lot of Christians, especially evangelical Christians, is that they've conflated the two. They see that if the Bible says this, that must be the theological claim. And I think there's an important difference that, people can be Christians and disagree with the Bible as their theology differs from the Bible. And acknowledging that there is a difference between theology and biblical studies and somehow figuring out how that works within your own faith, I think is very important. Um, but yeah, I feel like I've talked a lot. What are your thoughts?
No, I'd let you talk because you know so much. Like literally, my definitions were biblical studies, study of the Bible,
Yeah.
theology, study of religious beliefs and divinity.
Yeah.
So I had very simple terms, but those deserve more expansion because, as people recognize this stuff, that may lead to them asking more questions.
Mhm.
Looking at things from different ways doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong or you're betraying anything. Honestly, I feel like it's better to ask questions than to just blindly accept.
Yeah. And this is why in biblical studies you get a variety of perspectives. You get feminist biblical studies, queer biblical studies, black biblical studies, and it's because the biblical scholar knows that there are inherent biases. It's impossible to remove your biases from the text, and what we often consider to be normal or average, or without putting any bias into it, is very often a white European male perspective onto the text. And we see that as the general idea, and the general you know, um, non-biased interpretation of the text. And the biblical scholar should theoretically know that you can't completely remove yourself from that bias, which is why, like, I could do a feminist biblical scholarship, but it probably wouldn't be as complete and as well written as feminist biblical scholarship from an actual woman. So we can look at it from these perspectives and understand how the Bible works, and see what can be brought to light that would be looked past and forgotten from a different perspective, from the white European male perspective, for example.
Maybe that's why it's so important that we encourage people to go into some of these things more, like from different backgrounds,
Mm,
because then you do get more people coming from their own journeys and people can talk and communicate and the world would be enriched.
yeah,
We'll get there. We'll get there.
we'll get there.
We'll
but
get
but I
there.
think that leads us into the last definition that we kind of want to talk about, that you brought up, being
Yes.
ethnocentrism. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Why did you want to discuss this word?
I wanted to discuss this word because I think people not only need to hear it, that they need to hear the definition and some examples.
Mhm.
Because othering people is such an easy thing to do. I have seen so many people look at something and that's different from them and say, that's demonic, that's wrong. But why do you think it's demonic? Why do you think that's wrong? And that may be because of ethnocentrism. So when you are looking at something from an ethnocentric point of view, you are setting your own culture as like the baseline. Like this is normal, this is acceptable. Anything outside of this is not. Is that how you would define it?
Yeah, yeah. Keep going. Keep
Um,
cooking, as they would say.
let me cook. And so we need to step out of that if we want to look at other people's beliefs or practices without our own bias covering our eyes. And I mean, it is going to influence you. But some examples of this are guinea pigs in Peru. In Peru, a large amount of the population eats guinea pigs. And they even have this festival where they dress up guinea pigs and then cook them. And
Mm,
to some people, they might be like, that's weird. They're eating pets, but that's one of the main sources of protein. Like, they probably couldn't get things like chicken or cows, or, you don't know what protein options there were, but this was one of them. And it is
mm,
culturally significant. It does not make it wrong. It does not make it incorrect just because you grew up eating beef and chicken and pork, like just because it's different. And another example is the haka, which is a New Zealand. I'm not sure how I want to define it, but if you've seen the haka or if you've heard of the haka, you know what it is. But I keep seeing it being demonized because it was
mm,
used as a symbol of protest. But it is one. It is one for the Maori people.
mm.
It's a They use it in protest. They use it in celebration. It is part of their culture. Just because it's not something you would do doesn't mean it's wrong.
Yeah.
I feel
No,
very passionate about this.
definitely. No, like it's definitely, this idea of ethnocentrism as seeing your own culture, your own setting as the norm. And anything outside that norm can often be demonized as being, you know, bad or wrong. Um, and so often in how we talk and how, a lot of people say things, it's this white American straight male norm that is, given, which, I think we should stay away from the term normal unless we say it's normal for so and so. And it's impossible to distance yourself from your own cultural, your own settings, which is why, as I was saying with the biblical studies, if you acknowledge your biases, it can help by, talking about what this perspective's from. um and like in the study of religion, even like, it's if you're a Christian per se and you're interested in learning about Hinduism, you shouldn't ask what the doctrine of salvation is in Hinduism. Like, you, because that's just not, a doctrine of theology that happens in Hinduism and other religions. And and if you hear that as a Christian, you think, oh, they don't have a doctrine of salvation, then of course I'm not going to be Hindu. And it's because you are asking the wrong questions. So I think when studying other religions, taking yourself out of that situation, out of that position of, hey, what I know is right and what they're doing is wrong, I think it's important to know where your biases come from. There's a TikTok account. I don't remember who it is, but she's Catholic, but every Sunday she goes to a different church or a different religious institution, and she talks about it as, like how what's similar to her and like how she was raised as Catholic, but also like how it's different and what she learned from it. And it's done in this very generous, very, kind way. And I think that's how we should be studying things. Like, hey, I come from this perspective. This is what I know, and I'm going to acknowledge that this is different, but that doesn't make it bad. It makes it interesting. It makes us something that we can learn. And I think that's a really good way to study religion.
And I also just think it makes you a kinder human being
Yeah.
because when you stop putting yourself at the center and you start looking at other people that they may eat differently from you, they may use different spices. That doesn't mean their food is stinky. It just means it's different, but different doesn't mean wrong.
Yeah, different doesn't mean wrong.
I'm about to cry.
Oh no, don't cry.
Don't cry. No, I just like because it really it starts off casual when you're a kid. And I'm thinking about the stinky food comments I heard people make about other people's cultural dishes in the cafeteria,
Hmm.
and it kind of just grows from there.
Yeah. Yep. When your culture is seen as normal, it distances others. And we can do better as humans.
We can and we will. Maybe that should be the resolution for the entire
Hey,
world for the year.
be better as humans.
Be better as humans. Well, this was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I know
No,
we
it
wanted to
was
keep this conversation brief, but we went over again, as
as
we
always.
are to do. Yeah, I hope everyone learned something. I learned stuff.
Yeah. And if you didn't and you think that we need to learn something, let us know. Send us a message on, any of our social medias or email us any of the social medias that Jodie will mention because she knows all of them that we have.
We are on TikTok, Instagram, Bluesky, Twitter. I won't call it the other thing, YouTube. And you know what? We'll start a Facebook. If the need is there, we will start a Facebook group.
Right.
I am not opposed, but hey, leave a like, leave a comment, please. Please comment. Matthew is just at the bit, ready to respond.
Oh yeah.
And
It's
if
on
you're
my phone.
unlucky, if you're unlucky enough to get me, you might win an argument. You never know.
Hey, we're not here to argue. We're here to learn and talk. Well, I'm not here to argue.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
See, this is Matthew and I talked about this. The true reason we started this podcast was to deprogram me. And as you can
Yeah.
see, I am quick to a punch. But I had a
Oh,
lot of fun this week, guys.
yeah.
Please look forward to next week's episode, whatever we put out.
Yeah. It'll be fun, whatever it is. But yeah, have a good one.
Bye, guys.